World War II was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, bringing devastation on a scale never seen before. But when it finally ended in May 1945, not everyone got the memo. While most of the German forces accepted defeat and surrendered, some Nazi soldiers simply refused to give up. They dug in, continuing to fight long after Germany's official capitulation, defying reality in an almost surreal display of stubbornness or misplaced loyalty. So what happened to these die-hard Nazis? Why did they keep resisting even when the war was lost? In today's video, we're going to dive deep into the stories of these last German holdouts, uncovering how they held on, sometimes for months, and in one case, even until September. The German surrender came in two parts. The first was Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, when he realized that his dream of a 1,000-year Reich was nothing more than rubble. A few days later, on May 8th, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who briefly took control of the remnants of Nazi Germany, officially surrendered to the Allied forces. With that act, the war in Europe was over. But not everyone was ready to put down their guns. Let's start with Western Europe, where fortified German garrisons continued to hold out, even after the end of the war. In France, the Germans had heavily fortified several key Atlantic ports during their occupation, using them as U-boat bases for operations in the Atlantic. These coastal fortresses were virtually impenetrable, with tens of thousands of troops holed up behind thick concrete walls. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they advanced swiftly across France, liberating town after town. But these heavily fortified German strongholds were largely ignored. Rather than assault them and face high casualties, the Allies opted to isolate the garrisons, surrounding them and waiting for them to run out of supplies. Take the port town of Lorient, for example. German forces here held out for almost a week after the official surrender, clinging to the faint hope of some miraculous reversal. Eventually, they saw the futility of continuing to resist and surrendered peacefully. It was a rather anticlimactic end to their defiance. Before giving up, some of the German soldiers reportedly spent their last days of freedom playing volleyball to pass the time. Further north, the Channel Islands, Britain's only occupied territory during the war, were another bastion of German resistance. These islands, although strategically insignificant, had been heavily fortified by the Germans, who transformed them into mini-fortresses. When the tide of war turned against them, they became completely isolated, cut off from resupply. When Germany surrendered, the occupiers on the Channel Islands were in dire straits, with both soldiers and civilians on the brink of starvation. The local German commander surrendered the day after the official capitulation, no doubt relieved that the nightmare was finally over. For the starving troops, it wasn't so much an act of defiance as it was survival, having endured months of hunger in a siege that never really began. Now let's talk about one of the most ironic twists of the entire war, Dunkirk. This French town was where, back in 1940, the British Army had been cornered by the advancing Germans, barely escaping annihilation in the famous Dunkirk evacuation. Fast forward to 1945 and the tables had turned. The Germans found themselves the ones trapped in Dunkirk, surrounded by Allied forces. Under the command of Vice Admiral Friedrich Frisius, a garrison of around 10,000 German soldiers defended the town. Remarkably, they managed to repel several Allied attempts to capture the town. In one last, desperate act, Frisius launched the final German offensive in France on April 5, 1945, pushing Allied forces back 15 kilometers before digging in for what would be their final stand. After Germany's surrender, Frisius held out for one more day before accepting defeat. But the most fascinating holdouts weren't even in Western Europe. In Norway, a large contingent of German forces had been stationed to guard against an Allied invasion from the north. By May 1945, there were close to 400,000 German soldiers stationed in the country, vastly outnumbering the local Norwegian population. Despite their superior numbers, The German forces in Norway had mostly been living in relative peace compared to the rest of the collapsing Nazi war machine. They were cut off from the main front and had little to do but wait out the war. After Germany's surrender, it took until May 11th for the German commander in Norway to lay down his arms. What's interesting about Norway is that there was real fear that the Germans would bunker down and continue resisting for longer. They were well supplied and isolated, and there were concerns that the Norwegians might have to wage a long, drawn-out campaign to flush them out. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the German forces eventually capitulated without much drama. Further east, in the Baltic, we find an even more bizarre chapter in the story of Nazi holdouts. In the tiny country of Latvia, a massive group of 200,000 German soldiers and their Latvian collaborators had been encircled by Soviet forces. Even after Admiral Dönitz's miraculous naval evacuations, which saved hundreds of thousands of Germans from capture, this pocket of resistance remained trapped. On May 10th, they finally surrendered, but their ordeal was far from over. The Soviets, in their typically ruthless fashion, shipped most of the German soldiers off to Siberian labor camps, where many would die from exhaustion and the brutal conditions. Then there's the case of the German forces in the Mediterranean. On the island of Crete and several smaller Greek islands, German forces held on for a few days after the surrender, unwilling or unable to accept that the war was over. Pockets of German resistance also remained in Yugoslavia, where brutal fighting between Nazis and partisans continued even after the official end of the war. Some of the violence was so extreme that it's difficult to discuss in detail, but suffice it to say, many Nazi soldiers died in these final bloody engagements. But perhaps the strangest story of all comes from the cold, barren island of Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. Here, a small group of German soldiers had been stationed to operate a secret weather station, helping provide forecasts for the Kriegsmarine's U-boat operations. Completely isolated, they had no idea the war had ended. It wasn't until September 6, 1945, that they were discovered by Norwegian hunters, who informed them that their beloved Third Reich had been defeated months ago. These stories of the last Nazi holdouts paint a complex picture of defiance, desperation, and sometimes plain ignorance. Whether they were fighting for their beliefs, waiting for a miracle, or simply unaware that the war was over, these soldiers represent a strange and often overlooked chapter of World War II's end. If you've enjoyed this exploration into the post-surrender holdouts, be sure to subscribe and join us for more deep dives into history's forgotten moments.